Thank you very much. That was an incredibly kind introduction, and it's one that I take very seriously because, well, first I want to repay the thank you. You know, it's always very nice to have somebody say nice things about you, particularly when they're younger than you and could easily sort of look at you as sort of old and tired and not all that inspiring, which is like how my kids look at me. My kids are younger though, so I mean, you know, to have teenagers and like young adults feel anything positive about you at all when you're 42 is good. So I'm just going to savor this for a minute. Just let me let it soak in for a second. And I want to say too how important it is that you all are doing the work that you're doing. A week ago, I had the incredible honor, so as to keep this discussion intergenerational in nature, had the incredible honor, one that I didn't really anticipate I would ever have, of sharing a stage with Angela Davis in Oakland. And we were doing a dialogue on race and, you know, sort of the state of the country. And somebody asked her in the audience, you know, what does she tell young people when people ask her, you know, what can we do? What should we be doing? That kind of thing. And her answer, which was similar to mine, though it was stated far more eloquently than I could have, but that's because it's Angela Davis, and it will be more eloquent than most of us are capable of offering. She said, you know, I really don't have a lot of advice for young people. For the most part, when I look at young people doing the things that they're already doing, my real answer to them is, I don't know what to tell you to do better. All I need to know is, what do you need me to do to support you? Because it's really people who are quite a bit younger than those of us who've been doing the work for a long time, who are usually doing the most incredible work. And really the problem is not them. It's never been them. It's always been young people in every generation who have pushed these issues forward. And we sometimes forget that as we age out of that thing called youth, and we are no longer capable of perhaps claiming that mantle, that really it's those folks who are doing some of the hardest work. So our answer to them should not be, you know, sort of the 1 through 10. Here's what you need to be doing. Ella Baker, after all, did not call that first meeting of SNCC so that she could sit those young people down and tell them what to do in 1960. She got them together because she anticipated that they would have answers that neither she nor any of the older folks that she had been working with for years in the ministerial alliances with which she had worked, or SCLC or the NAACP, were capable of. And so I think for those of us who were older than the young people who just introduced me this afternoon, what we should be saying is very simply, how can we show up to support you? What do you need us to do? And we will follow you. We really don't need to lead you because you're more than capable of doing that on your own. So I want to thank you all for the kind words, and I just want to repay them before I get started. It's a very strange moment right now, in a way, because this is a moment when I would venture to say that we as a country, more than ever, need to be having a conversation about racism and race and its meaning and its impact. And yet it is a moment at which we are being told, more so than perhaps at any point in the history of the country, certainly in the lives of the people within this room, it is the moment where we're being told more so than ever that we need to speak of it less, maybe not at all, in spite of the actual truth. You know, the truth is that in 20 to 25 years, half the country is going to be people of color, half will be white. That's a fact. Doesn't matter whether folks like it or not. I know there are some white folks in Arizona in particular that are very upset about that. But what I also know about white folks in Arizona is that their average age is about 137. So with a combination of some patience and some decent organizing, we will probably outlast them. And I am not, please do not tweet, for those of you who do, that I have called for the death of old white people in Arizona. I've learned that I have to clear that up because people think that when I say that I'm actually advocating the genocide of elderly white folks in Arizona. I'm not advocating their death. I'm just noting that we all indeed do die. Some quite a bit sooner than others, and that demographic trends will continue regardless of what some in this country may or may not like. So we need to either deal with the reality or we can run from it, but the reality is the reality. And so in a moment like that, when half the country is on the verge of being folks of color, half white, we have to have a conversation about racial inequity. Not because it's fun. People of color don't like to have the conversation with white folks because they're used to being shut down, retaliated against, told that they're exaggerating, making things up, seeing things, being hypersensitive. White folks don't like to have the conversation around people of color because we're afraid we're going to say the wrong thing, say something stupid, sound racist. Oh my God, the black and brown folk might think we're racist. Well, newsflash, there's already a reasonable suspicion that we might be, so let's just move on, you know? You can't be hurt with the knowledge that you just go ahead and admit to. You know, no one can use that as a weapon against you. So when people of color already anticipate that we might have a little something to hide when it comes to our biases, and the research bears that out, then we need to just confront that and have the conversation rather than continuing to run from it, and by doing so only confirming that indeed we have something that we'd rather not talk about for reasons that I think you can imagine. But we're being told we can't have this conversation in spite of the demographic change, because we really don't need to. That's what we're told, because of course there's a black guy in the White House and that's all that matters, and now the problem is over with, so we should all quit whatever jobs we've had up to this point and go find other work. Of course, it is totally true that racism has been eradicated since November of 2008, just as I'm sure you know that sexism and patriarchal oppression of women was fully dissolved and eradicated in Pakistan after Benazir Bhutto won election there in 1988. And again in 1991, or after Indira Gandhi did the same in India, or Golda Meir in Israel, or Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain, or Corazon Aquino in the Philippines. All of those places and others you can probably name have had female heads of state. And although the women in the room probably didn't know it, surprise, there's no sexism there. So you might want to check out those places, because that sounds like a pretty amazing place for women to live. I'm going to tell my two little girls, who are 9 and 7, that as soon as they are of age to make the decision, they should move to one or perhaps all 5 in a row of those places where men apparently no longer marginalize females. Don't let the sarcasm in my voice throw you. I'm absolutely serious. There's no sexism in those places. Of course, we're also being told we shouldn't have the conversation because even if it is a problem, the more we talk about it, the worse it gets. Folks will say that. Right? Look, you know, there wasn't a problem until you brought it up. Racism is more of a problem when you speak about it. We just didn't talk about it so much. The problem would go away. There is not another social problem on the face of the planet about which we would say this. World hunger, for instance. You probably wouldn't say, you know, world hunger, that's a terrible thing. Shh, don't talk about it. Don't talk. If you just don't talk about world hunger, food will miraculously appear on the plates of starving people. Just like that. It's amazing. It's an amazing thing we never thought of, or we would have done it 100 years ago when people were starving then too. Or crime. Crime scare you? Me too. I'm scared of crime. Shh, don't talk about it. Don't talk about it. Because if you talk about crime, that's why people are victimized. If you just didn't speak about it, no one would ever get held up at gunpoint again. My God, what an easy, cost-free solution. Or schools not working, failing kids not learning how to read or do math. Don't worry about it, just don't talk about it. And everyone will get A's and become members of the National Honor Society by osmosis. That's how we solve social problems. We just don't talk about them anymore. It's like blaming the speedometer on your car for the speeding ticket that you just got. It makes no sense. The speedometer didn't make you go 97 miles an hour. It just told you what the hell you were doing and probably shouldn't have been doing at that moment, you know. So with this particular issue, we run from it. And of course, there are folks on the right of the political spectrum. They have their reasons for running from it, but it's not only them. Even those who are on the nominally liberal left run from it, like the plague. They run from it differently. They may have different motivations for it, but regardless of one's motivations for not engaging in this conversation, the outcome is the same. Whether your motivation is political cover, whether your motivation is the potentiality of re-election, or whether your motivation is you just don't want to face the issue, the outcome of silence is the same and must be treated the same by those of us who care about these issues and not finessed in the name of politics. Those of us who are not running for office have to tell the truth, even when, and perhaps especially when those who are feel that they cannot. Because to be perfectly honest with you, the very first time that most of us became familiar with the current president was when he was a state senator. He was in this city for the Democratic Convention in 2004, and he gave the keynote address. For most of us, unless you're from Illinois, you didn't really know who Barack Obama was. He was a state senator running for the U.S. Senate, a position he would win a few months later that fall. And he got up and he gave, as is his tradition, you know, an incredibly insightful, well-delivered, well-crafted, well-scripted speech. But one line in that speech got more applause than any other line in the talk. And there were lots of applause breaks, but this one was the biggest. It's the part where he said, "We're not a black America and a white America, Latino America and an Asian America. We're the United States of America." And everybody went all noodly, you know, just was like, you know, people were falling out. It's like a 9-hour applause break. Started at 8 o'clock. By like 10, it's still going. I'm like, I got to go to bed. I'm tired. Woke up the next morning, turned on the Today Show. People are still like, damn, that's a good line. I'm exaggerating, but only by a little bit. It was a really long applause break. People really, really liked that line. But I remember thinking at the time, you know, how is it that someone as well-read as this, as incredibly erudite and intelligent as this individual, how is it that someone as well-informed as he could stand in front of millions of people and tell what he knows fundamentally to be a lie? Because he didn't say that as an aspirational statement. He didn't say, hopefully one day we will be this. He said it as a descriptive, as a present tense statement, even though he had to know better. He had to know better because of a lot of things. Evidence on job discrimination from MIT and the University of Chicago that had just come out that very summer, which said job applicants with white-sounding names 50% more likely to be called back than applicants with black-sounding names, even when all the qualifications were the same. He had to be familiar with it. The study was done in part at the University of Chicago, the very institution where he'd been teaching constitutional law all those years. He's on the listserv. He probably got the study before the rest of us saw it, but he couldn't speak of it. And he certainly couldn't talk about the evidence of racial health disparities, which is what I'm obviously here to speak about today. He couldn't talk about the fact that there are 100,000 African Americans in particular, and tens of thousands of other folks of color, in addition to black folks, who die every year because of excess mortality rates above and beyond that which would die if mortality rates between those folks of color and white folks were comparable. 100,000 people a year. Now, if one person is dragged to death behind a truck in Jasper, Texas, it will become a national story. We will all hear about it, as well we should. We will have politicians making political use out of that on one or another side of the issue, talking about the importance of dealing with hate crimes and the death of one individual. If 100,000 people, or in other words, 1 million people per decade, die because of excess mortality rates, that will not even be spoken on the lips of candidates for high office in either party, or even, for that matter, not so high office, for fear of upsetting some folks who just aren't prepared to hear about it. Or perhaps we will talk about it, but we won't talk about it in a really forthright way. So the president has certainly talked about racial health disparities at certain points along the way. He did it on the campaign trail a bit. He's done it since he became president a bit. But the way that, unfortunately, the nominally liberal side of the political aisle tends to speak of these issues is still an indirect manner in which we talk about race, but not racism. And I want us to talk a little bit about racism, because when the president and folks in the Democratic Party, for example, most of the time speak of racial health disparities, they are conflating racial disparities with class disparities, assuming they are the same and assuming that one can solve one by solving the other, even though the evidence says that that is not true. The problem right now is that we have three primary theories that are used to explain racial health disparities and mortality disparities, and none of them are accurate. Or at the very least, they are inadequate to the task of understanding the problem. Those theories are economic, behavioral, and genetic. I want to take these in backward order because they are increasingly logical going up the scale. And they'll start with the most absurd of these, which is the genetic explanation. This is making a big comeback in the last several years, sometimes because of drug makers who see the opportunity to cash in by claiming that black folks have special diseases or special types of heart problems or special types of blood pressure issues that only their medication can solve. Even though they haven't really tested their medication on black folks relative to other folks, they haven't done any double-blind studies, but they're just sure that this particular medication will be perfect for African American peoples because of some genetic abnormality that black folks have, ignoring the last 50 years of genetic and biological research, which suggests that those kinds of scientific classifications regarding race are scientifically illiterate, but that never stops someone trying to make a buck. But it's not just among drug makers, it's also among pop doctors. What do I mean by pop doctors? I mean doctors that are given the imprimatur of Oprah Winfrey and therefore determined to be legitimate physicians. So not Dr. Phil, we know he's not a doctor, but the other one, Dr. Oz, who actually is a doctor. He's actually a licensed physician. And a couple of years ago, he went on Oprah Winfrey's show and announced for probably 15 million viewers, more than we'll ever hear, not only me, but anyone else, speak about racism in the healthcare system, announced that the reason that African American folks have higher blood pressure than white folks is because when Africans were brought over from Africa in slave ships, they had to retain salt so as not to dehydrate. and as a result pass down a genetic and biological inherited trait to, because that's how fast evolution happens, it's like 300 years. This is absolute scientific illiteracy, masquerading as science, being propagated by a doctor, and Oprah is sitting there buying it. As our, oh my God, really? You mean we retain salt so as not to dehydrate, and that's, my God, so it's our problem, it's our fault. You see, we're messed up, is essentially what black folks were being encouraged to believe by Dr. Oz. Now, this thesis about salt retention used to be actually a very popular thesis about 35 years ago, and then it was debunked in actual medical journals, none of which Dr. Oz would have read, and none of which the 15 million viewers would have read, so there you have it. That is the explanation that more people in the last 2 or 3 years have heard to explain racial health disparities than any of the other ones, even though there is literally no evidence for it and plenty of evidence against it. Moving up the scale of legitimacy, getting a little less absurd as we go, but still absurd, right, are the behavioral/cultural explanations. These are the ones that sound like this. Well, yes, there are racial health disparities, and that's terrible. We really should do something about that. But really, the only way we're going to get a hold of that is if black and brown folks will start, exercising and just eat right. Stop eating all that bad food, okay? I lived in New Orleans for 10 years. Everybody in New Orleans ate the same high-fat fried food, but the health disparities between white and black, white and brown in New Orleans still manifested irrespective of what one did and did not consume. It's not that behavior and lifestyle choices don't affect health. I'm certainly not going to suggest that. But I am going to suggest a few things. First, that even to the extent those are real factors, right? Lack of exercise, lack of good nutrition, and they are legitimate factors. Food deserts are real, and they affect behavior, and they affect what individuals can and cannot get access to in terms of food. I worked in public housing projects as a community organizer for 15 months, and I know that the stores didn't have fresh produce. We're all very clear on that. But even to the extent that we have behavioral/lifestyle/cultural decisions being made in certain communities about consumption of certain products, we can't ignore the structural roots of those decisions. In other words, people do not make individual behavioral decisions in a vacuum, divorced from the social and cultural and historical context. Those quote-unquote ghettos did not just manifest on their own. They did not manifest by accident. In places like New Orleans, they were deliberately created by a white elite power structure that put the interstate right through the heart of the two oldest black communities, one, the oldest free black community in the United States, the Treme, and the second, the 7th Ward, the old Creole community in New Orleans, used to be one of the most prosperous black business districts in America, plowed the interstate through it, knocked down hundreds of homes, hundreds of black and brown-owned businesses so as to allow white folks who lived in the suburbs where only they could live to get back and forth to work because they still worked downtown. So the ghettos were created, not by the people who live in them, but very much so by people who didn't.